Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Nick O'Donoghue. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of CDC, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you today to the latest in our Insight series. And it's also my pleasure to welcome somebody that I have known and admired for a long time, and that is John Elkington. And John is the founder of Volance. And you know, at a time when we all live in a world where questions of sustainability and actions in climate change and corporate responsibility are sort of front and center across the dialogue around the world and among governments and the private sector. It's fair to say that long before this subject became topical, there was John, and John was talking about them probably 40 years ago. And he's been described accurately as a writer, as a thought leader, as a serial entrepreneur, but most of all, he describes himself as an environmentalist. He is considered the godfather of sustainability. He's the originator of the term triple bottom line. He's authored 20 books, including the one Green Swans, the coming boom in regenerative capitalism that we're going to talk about today. He sat on 70 boards. He's advised scores of corporations and companies all around the world. His book, Green Swans, is described as a draft manifesto for capitalism, democracy, and sustainability. So that's a big, big subject. It's hugely topical, and there's really nobody better qualified to talk about it today than John. So it's a great pleasure and a great privilege for me to introduce John Elkington.
Thank you, Nick, and hello, everyone. So I've been asked to just do a very short presentation, which I will now do with the blessing of technology. And if we can make that work. Nick, can you see that up on the screen now? Fantastic. Okay, so it's a wonderful privilege to be part of this Insight series. I also admire CDC from a safe distance, and I admire Nick too. So I'm going to talk about Green Swans. I'm going to talk about the 2020s as an exponential decade, and I'll explain what I mean by that. But some people in listening today may know that about 2 years ago, I did a product recall for the triple bottom line, which Nick just mentioned. And the Harvard Business Review, which was the channel for the recall, said that was the first time any management concept had ever been recalled to their knowledge. And so the thinking that I'm about to just share flows on from that time. And a lot of it went into the book Green Swans, which has already been mentioned. And that word regenerative in the, and particularly regenerative capitalism in the subtitle, may have struck some people when the book came out in April as a little far-fetched. Could capitalism ever be regenerative? Well, some of you will also know that last week, the CEO of Walmart, so the world's largest retail company, regardless of what we think about them, announced in New York as part of Climate Week that Walmart was committing to become a regenerative company. Now, I'm not claiming agency here. I've picked up on something that was happening more broadly, but I think anyone who was thinking this was delusional might just pay a little bit more attention to what's going on in major companies now. So the exponential decade, let me just say a little bit more about that. When I started to talk about that term, last year, it may again have sounded a bit strange, but now you've had the Gates Foundation just in recent weeks talking about then the previous 25 weeks having wiped out 25 years of progress in the development world. So I don't need to sort of underscore the impact of the pandemic of COVID-19, but it is an extraordinary time. I actually happen to think that it could actually benefit us, not just simply destroy in a way. And one of the things I've been trying to say to companies, which is largely where we focus our efforts since the Sustainable Development Goals came out in 2015, is that they are not simply incremental goals. They are system change goals. And you can view them as exponential goals as well. If you just take the first two, no poverty and zero hunger by 2030, that's a super exponential pair of goals. And yet most people in business and in the financial markets are not yet seeing them in quite that way. And part of the reason is that our brains really were not configured to think exponentially or to act exponentially. And yet that is where we now are, and that's what we now need to learn how to do. So where in all of that do swans of various colors fit in? So pretty much everyone listening in will have heard of Nassim Nicholas Taleb, and I suspect most of you will have read at least part of his book, The Black Swan, which came out in 2007, just before the financial crash. And people have been asking him left, right, and center recently, is COVID-19 a black swan? In fact, they've been assuming that it is. And his answer is, no, it's not. Because a proper black swan is an outlier in the sense that it's a complete surprise. It has an extreme off the scale impact. And unfortunately, after it's crashed through, we look back at what's just happened to us and we don't properly understand why whatever happened did happen, and therefore we set ourselves up for failure again. So black swans, we understand a bit better. What about green swans? Well, green swans for me are trajectories, trends, initiatives, developments, which instead of black swans, which take us exponentially very often where we don't want to go, green swans at least potentially take us exponentially where we do want to go. So I'm not going to read out the definitions, but simply to say these are not individual companies. These are not individual leaders, although leaders and companies may well have green swan characteristics, or development banks or whatever else. But for me, they're market shifts, and they're profound market shifts. So when I'm asked to give an example, one of the ones I've given in recent times is the European Union's Green Deal. It's sort of green recovery plan, which has got very strong social inclusion and decarbonization components. And whatever it is, 1.82 trillion euros pledged in that general direction. Well, we'll see how that plays out. And I'm always suspicious of big numbers, particularly put out by the European Commission. But nonetheless, this level of ambition, I think, is exactly what we need to see. Now, as it happens, a number of digitally driven technologies, as we all know, are going in an extraordinary direction and in a way, very complementary direction. So if you look at solar here, or you look at wind, or you look at increasingly at battery technology, the energy industry is in the process of being transformed. And there's a group called Rethink X that have looked at transportation. They've looked at the cattle and dairying industries, and they see very similar patterns of exponential disruption. Now, of course, any new technological or economic development brings unintended consequences. And if I just stick with the renewable energy piece for a moment, whether it's solar arrays now coming to the end of their useful life, or the wind vanes of aerogenerators, we suddenly find that we don't know what to do with these things. We talk about circular economies, but how do we bring these toxic solar arrays or these huge great bits of non-recyclable wind power machinery back into the economy? And it's very difficult to work out how we will do that with the previous generation of products, but hopefully we can design future ones better. One of the things, just towards the conclusion, that we're seeing a growing number of interesting leadership companies doing is recognizing that this is not simply additional, this is not simply citizenship, something strapped on the edge of what they do. This is simply about future markets. This is about what's going to be required of them, of businesses over time. And they also are beginning to understand both that they can't do this on their own, individual companies can't do this on their own, they've got to partner, but also the people in their organizations who best understand the emerging realities, they're younger people. So this is a company, Spanish company, Acciona, that we've been working with. They're an infrastructure and renewable energy company, but operating globally. And they've been pulling out 30 of their fast-track younger people, trying to bring them into the decision-making now rather than leading it until a lot later. Now, we did a report with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development earlier this year on COVID-19 and its impact and its implications, which I didn't write myself. I recommend, because I think it's some useful insights in that. But on the right, you have a diagram that Bill Sharp originally put together, the 3 Horizons model. And we've been populating it with a series of events that we've done with companies and also with a regulatory agency, the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency. And what I think we see is an old order declining, a period where we talked a lot and tried to deliver responsibility in various different forms, responsibility, accountability, transparency, and so on. But now what we're hearing is more and more leaders talking about resilience. And the Financial Times today had a section on supply chain resilience. But the unfortunate thing is that you can't just simply wish resilience into a national economy or into an economic region or into an industry or into a company or whatever. You've got to invest in resilience. And the development world has known this for a very long time. So that's why regeneration is going to become increasingly important. Some people have suggested that regeneration is likely to be sustainability on steroids. I don't see that. I think sustainability remains an important concept, but it's slightly static. Regeneration is not. We've got to regenerate our economies, our societies, and most crucially of all, our biosphere. So if I may, I'll say thank you at this stage of the game and hand over control of the slides and hand back to Nick.
Thank you, John. Thank you. So I'm going to ask, I have a number of questions I'm going to put to John, and then also we have on the screen a Q&A function. So I'd encourage you all, we'll have 15 minutes at the end after we've talked to John, after we've talked also to Amelie Ammon from our climate strategist from JP Morgan, we'll have an opportunity to answer your questions. So I'd encourage you to put, to use the Q&A function and to input the questions. So John, let me start, and I suppose I'm going to start it a little bit skeptically, in the sense that what you're talking about is really a profound sort of systemic shift, and you know, we know when we go to, or when we see leaders, corporate leaders at Davos and speaking all around the world, that sustainability is really one of the things that's absolutely uppermost in their mind. But then when you look at, and I was responsible at JP Morgan for running a large team of analysts, and analysts look at, evaluate companies' performance, and they build financial models and they forecast share prices. They don't have any data to go on when it comes to sustainability, so they don't really consider it. Most companies' chief executives, to be fair, are largely driven by their sort of compensation is largely driven by their share price. So I suppose the question is whether or not this systemic change can really happen without some form of incentives. And people talk about the importance, for example, of carbon taxes. People talk more recently about the need for more impact-weighted accounts. So I suppose the question is really, can this work without a significant change in the way we in the way we look at companies, measure companies' performance, and incentivize chief executives?
Well, the simple answer, Nick, and you know it, is no. We need incentives, but incentives can be painful and they can be pleasurable. They can be negative. They can be positive. And I think what we're seeing, I chaired a session in the City of London a couple of weeks back, and the head of Federated Hermes was there. And one of the things he was saying was, here we suddenly are in a transformed reality, and things that were considered completely impossible have suddenly been done by companies, by, to some degree, financial markets, but particularly by governments. So the incentives are coming at us, and at the moment it's a pandemic, and there will be more of those. Behind that is Amelie's area of the climate emergency. And behind that, you've got the biodiversity problems and a range of other issues as well. But I think we're at actually a very interesting inflection point. And I think the New York Times last week published a piece on Milton Friedman's 50-year-old now statement of what the purpose of business was. And I think Friedman is a very brilliant man, but he's dictated the terms of economic discourse for a very long period of time. And in one way or another, reality is showing that Friedmanism takes you so far, but it really doesn't set you up for success in the sort of realities that we're now moving into. And then just a final thing to your point about metrics and measurement and analysts and all the rest of it. There's no question that the environment, social and governance, ESG industry has done better than many other parts of the financial markets in this sort of crisis. But I don't think that if we scaled up ESG as it currently is, and everyone in the financial world started to use ESG techniques and models and the rest of it, that we would have saved the world, delivered the Sustainable Development Goals, or anything like that. So I think we're actually at the very early stages of a very rapid evolutionary curve. And I think the development banks have a crucial role to play in all of that.
Let's stay in Friedman for a second, because the other thing that Friedman talked about was the role of government, or the absence of a role for government. And so, so what are your thoughts on? And I suppose there we talk about taxes and accounting requirements and so on. But what do you think the role for government is in ensuring this transition takes place?
Well, one of, for me at least, one of Friedman's most memorable lines was something to the effect that if you put the federal government in the United States in charge of the Sahara, you would run out of sand in 5 years. Well, it was a memorable line, and at times I'm sure governments play into that sort of prejudice. But I don't think there's any way in which business and financial markets, even if working in concert, can do all of this on their own. Governments absolutely have to play a role, but it has to be an effective one. And so government has to be, as far as possible, clean. So the bribery and corruption sort of agenda is even more important in the era that we're going into than it was previously. It's got to have sound targeting and a way of monitoring progress against those sort of goals and targets. But critically, and this is your earlier point, there have got to be incentives. We cannot simply rely on people to do this because this is the right thing for their children or their grandchildren or billions of people elsewhere in the world. They've got to be incentivized, and that's particularly true if you're dealing with economies and capitalism and business and so on. Now, those incentives, once again, can be tax breaks and things like that, but they can also be penalties. I mean, where industries like the fossil fuels industry, which are demonstrably undermining the health of our climate, need to be taxed over time out of existence. So your point about carbon tax, absolutely fundamentally important. We've taken a very long time to get there, but the nature of the world in which we're moving into the 2020s is what has been described as a gradually then suddenly world, where we think we know what's going on and what's going to take us into the future. And then boom, it could be COVID, it could be something else, but we're suddenly scrambling to do new stuff and work out where we fit into a transformed order. So government's essential.
The other issue, I suppose, also pertinent to incentives is the question of, and I know you've done this, have enormous experience in working with so many large and smaller companies around the world. There's a question of how you change the culture of a company, and we are all inspired. Paul Pullman wrote the sort of prologue introduction to your book. He's an inspiring leader that clearly changed the culture of a large company. But that's a difficult thing to do. And when you're, and what often seems to happen is that people get to chief executive, then they start talking about sustainability and they start talking about corporate responsibility. But underneath it, you've got all the other people, all trying to become the chief executive, who still stay focused on the sort of bread and butter business of sort of maximizing returns. So based on your experience, what do you tell companies, or what do you tell chief executives and boards about this element, about how culture can change?
Well, it's funny because today we've got a new board member. He's German. He used to run one of the Bosch companies, both the CEO and chairman. And one of the things he was saying a moment ago was that you've got to, as an incoming CEO, you've probably got about a year and a half in which you can make a big change. And after that, you're just overwhelmed by events. And you mentioned Paul Pullman, and one of the most memorable things Paul did was right at the beginning of his tenure was to say to the hedge funds, if you want to know what I'm going to deliver in terms of financial performance a quarter or 3 quarters ahead, I don't want your money. Now that was no CEO, to my knowledge, had previously done that. Now, Paul himself said if it had been 3 years in, he couldn't have done that. But just his board probably didn't want to sack him as soon as he arrived. So I think there's a personal courage element of this. There's a timing element of this. I also think one of the things that business leaders have woken up to is elements of what they're being asked to do now are already happening elsewhere. And so one of the things that can be useful is to selectively pick out competitors, customer industries, whatever, that are already modeling some of the new mindsets and behaviors and so on, and go and see them. So it used to be, you mentioned my 40-year criminal record. Well, a lot of the early years was spent bringing Greenpeace and Oxfam and Transparency International into major companies and saying, look, don't just trust us, listen to these people and hear their view. So that was bringing the external reality in. Now we're seeing leadership groups starting to go, groups like Leaders Quest, taking people out and showing them very different realities that could well become make or break for these particular companies. So I think you've got to have courage. You've got to be willing to talk to people who are very different from you. And some of those people are inside your own company. And I think one of the things that I mentioned with the Acciona thing, you're starting to see the top teams and companies realizing that the real market intelligence, the intelligence about the future directions of markets are actually among their own people, their young people. And they somehow got to find a way of bringing these people through, not just listening to them because they don't necessarily yet know everything they need to know, but sending them out as ambassadors to learn and come back with new knowledge.
Yeah. So let's change the subject a little bit. I found one of the most interesting chapters in the book was where you talked about the role of technology, and you touched on that in your presentation, and you talked about some of the more specific sort of technological breakthroughs that you think are enabling this sort of systemic change. Talk about those for a little bit.
Well, I love technology. I find science and technology absolutely fascinating, but I'm equally aware that technology, particularly major systemic shifts in technology, bring unintended consequences. And I've been really very disappointed when I've gone to Silicon Valley over the years and I've asked people one standard question, which is, do they know of Thomas Midgley Jr.? And the answer is almost, I've only met one person who did. And the reason I ask, and it's in the book, and so you know, is that Thomas Midgley Jr. gave us leaded gasoline. I mean, he had 100 patents to his name. He was a brilliant chemical engineer, but he was at his height with General Motors and DuPont in the 1920s and 1930s. He gave us leaded gasoline. He gave us CFCs, freons. So he's been described as the single organism in Earth's history that has done most damage to the planet. He blew the stratospheric ozone hole. And then tragically, he succumbed to polio and built a robotic bed and it strangled him. And I only tell that because as a species, we love technology. We think solar, we think whatever it is computer power is going to save us. And we have to be very much more cautious than I think we're sometimes inclined to be. So I think technology is fascinating. I think what's going to come at sector after sector, I mentioned Rethink X. One of the things they're looking at is the way, for example, precision fermentation in the cattle and dairying industry will remove about 60% of the cattle in the United States. That's just the US. But this will have implications around the world. And this is synthetic meat, synthetic fish, synthetic chicken. Now, these sorts of technologies have massive consequences. Now, I happen to be a vegetarian, so I slightly welcome anything that means fewer animals are killed. But the consequences of this are profound. And very often, I don't think that the government policymakers are yet paying sufficient attention to how we integrate these new technologies without doing a great deal of collateral damage along the way.
So let's, before we bring in Emily, let's just as a final question, talk about the role of investment. And I'm particularly interested in two different classes of investors. One is the impact investment community, which has obviously grown up substantially in the last decade or so. And what role you think, how important a movement is that, and what role do you think that plays in this change? And also, obviously, specifically within that, I suppose, broad community of impact investment firms, the development finance community, and what organizations like CDC, what roles you think we can and should be playing?
Well, the one thing, Nick, I think we're all seeing now is that the financial market, after a long period of recalcitrance, is waking up, and different parts of it are waking up in different ways to different challenges or opportunities and so on, and at different speeds. But you look at the insurance and reinsurance industry and to the climate change issue that we're about to talk about, the insurers are now saying at 3 degrees, pretty much all the world is uninsurable. So, you've got that sort of message coming through, and some of the insurance groups are obviously big investors in their own right. Now, I think impact investment is immensely exciting. I think the way in which we've gone from a world where we only thought, I used to do environmental impact assessment in emerging and developing countries and so on, and we were almost exclusively looking for problems, the negative footprints. Now we're thinking much more constructively about the positive impacts, and we're thinking about how we measure positive impact and how we value it and how we reward and incentivize people for all of that good stuff. Now, I'm immensely excited about that. I chair an advisory board within Novartis where we're trying to put financial valuations on social and environmental progress. But I think the impact investment, it's grown spectacular, as you said, but $500 billion, that's a rounding error, not quite, but it's still very, very small proportion of the trillions of euros or dollars that sluice through the global economy routinely. And then to the question around, I think it's really important, but I don't think we should overestimate the short, by which I mean 5 to 10 year impact of some of that stuff, but I think it will be over time decisive. Then to the development banks, I think they're absolutely foundational. I think they're absolutely critical. I think, in many ways, the whole sort of Bretton Woods structure was built up around the development bank principle, and many of the early impact mindsets and methodologies were pioneered there. The one thing I would love to see, though, is that at the moment it strikes me very often that individual development banks and international development institutions are doing their own things so often. And I don't want a Vatican, I don't want everyone to suddenly sort of come under one roof, but I do wish we had more coordinated efforts. And just finally, the 4 big accounting companies just having announced within the last week and a half that they were going to come together and produce a single standard for sustainability reporting. On the one hand, I'm immensely excited about that. On the other hand, having seen Ernst & Young, just to name one, and Wirecard, you just wonder, are we replacing one problem with another? But we do need integrated standards, and I think the development banks have a crucial role to play in that, not just in mobilizing capital.
Great. Thanks, John. So at this point, I'm going to bring in Amelie. Amelie Amin is the head of climate strategy at CDC. She worked for a long time in a climate role at the UK government and with the IBD in Washington. So we're enormously pleased to have Amelie at CDC, and I'm going to ask her to talk, maybe share her reflections, not just on what she's seen in CDC in the last 6 months or so, but what she's seen develop over the last what progress she's seen over the last 10 years, and then specifically talk maybe a little bit, Amelie, about CDC, what we're doing and how we're laying out our climate strategy. And then after, then I'll come back and we'll have a conversation between Amelie and John. So Amelie.
Thank you. And it's a great honor and privilege to be with, well, both of you in terms of, leading this agenda of sustainability and impact. I think in the midst of the COVID, early stages of COVID, I read a review of Green Swans, and I must say it heartened me a lot in terms of the whole thesis that you put forward, John, around that, that we can, and, if we have the political will and leadership, that now really in this coming decade is the time for regeneration. And to a large extent, I think, most of my career and certainly my academic background, I did my PhD at SPRU, which was set up by Chris Freeman, Carlota Perez, who was there for many years. And in fact, my PhD very much based on Carlota Perez's techno-economic paradigms and implications for development. And, so reading, in fact, what was then a review of your book, it made me feel like maybe what was happening now with COVID was the big sort of disjuncture that we needed to actually be able to really, as many say now, build back better. The crisis where the global economy comes to a stop, as it did, provides an opportunity to actually build back in a way that is consistent with sustainable development, including tackling climate change and obviously the breakdown in biodiversity. And, I think having studied that, that's where my academic background comes from. I've been trying to do that throughout my various roles in government, 10 years in the UK government, 7 years in total at the Inter-American Development Bank. So, and in fact, a large part of my work at the IDB was very much, as you just said, John, trying to improve how the MDBs in particular collaborate more effectively. And I increasingly, and I think, again, this is sort of a reflection on what I've seen over the last 20 years, in fact, working in this area, is that there's been, and myself included, a huge focus on the international architecture for very, very good reasons. But increasingly, what I've started to see is it really doesn't matter what happens at the international architecture level in terms of how development banks collaborate if it's not working at the country level, if you're not bringing together different resources, expertise, areas of comparative advantage, different forms of finance, public finance, of course, the kind of capital that CDC brings, the expertise that we can bring, all of these things have to come together at the country level. And that's what I would say over the last 10, 20 years, I've increasingly come to that conclusion. I would say that I do believe that the Paris Agreement was an incredible achievement. It was much more ambitious than anyone anticipated it would be. It also places at its heart sustainable development and also this issue of economic transformation and transition. And I think that, along with the SDGs, all reinforces the points your book makes very, very eloquently, John, around this next decade being really the critical time and hopefully one of exponential change. Because I believe, and again, coming from SPRU, which is sort of focused on the role of technology, and in fact, SPRU's Chris Freeman made his name by writing a critique of the Limits to Growth book, which you obviously will be aware of, John. But I think the technology is there. We can't say we don't have the technology. The issue is, do we have the right institutions? Are the institutions reinforcing the best use of the technology we have in a way that can lead to the types of changes we know that society really wants. I mean, we all want to deliver on those SDGs, and we want to live, and we want our children and grandchildren to be able to live in an environment that where they can breathe safely, where they can, they're not being polluted at their very source. So, I think this next 10 years is critical. And I'll probably stop there, because there may be another question around COP26, but I do also believe that COP26 can be, hopefully, can hatch a lot of potential ducklings that can become those green swans that you talk about.
Thanks, Emily. And remember, for all of you, if you've got questions, you can put them on the Q&A function. John, I want to come back. I mean, Emily mentioned, touched on the sort of the great issue of the day, which is COVID, and potentially the opportunity that gives us to have a sort of a reset and build back better. I mean, there's also there's a school of thought that says actually a crisis of this magnitude, an economic crisis, as well as obviously a health crisis of this magnitude, could actually derail the powerful momentum that was building up behind the need to address the climate emergency. So I wonder how you feel about that.
Well, on bad days, I'm a pessimist, and I think the whole world is going to hell in a handbasket or a handcart or whatever it is meant to go to hell in. But on good days, and I was born an optimist, you have to be, if you're going to be in a field like this one, referring back to limits to growth onwards. I think on net from what I'm seeing at the moment in the business world, the effect is profoundly positive. I see CEOs beginning to be uncomfortably aware that the systemic crises that they had been warned about are not only a reality, but they're stacked up one behind another, and they to some degree they link to each other. So COVID is brought to us by courtesy of wildlife trafficking and bat guano, digging in caves and subway systems and airlines and so on. We've created a global system that is very vulnerable indeed to all sorts of shocks. Now, we happen to have one demonstration at the moment. We might well have other pandemics, but there will be other shocks. And, one pandemic that people often don't think about is obesity and chronic disease and diabetes. And I've worked with a Danish company for a long time, Novo Nordisk, looking at the way in which the shock of that pandemic could well collapse public healthcare systems in different parts of the world. So I'm not trying to sort of do the Old Testament piece of sort of renting my cloak and showering ashes on my head, but I am saying that we are moving into a much more challenging and a much more potentially dangerous period of our collective history. Our global governance systems that were constructed largely after the Second World War are no longer fit for purpose, and they're beginning to fail. And my own sense, and in the book, the first diagram is a U-bend, and it goes back to what just Amelie was saying, which is, I think there are long wave economic cycles in our economies. I think we are now into the downward part of the latest down wave, and these things do not recover overnight. You don't get a V-shaped or a U-shaped or a W-shaped recovery. These are things that will take 12 to 15 years if we're lucky, and a generation or two if we're not, to really crank through. So to your question, is this a bad thing? It depends. It depends what we choose to make of it. And if we choose to react in the right way, I think it could be a fantastic opportunity. Terrible thing to say with 1 million people already dead and a lot more likely to die. But we needed a shock like this. And question is now, what do we do with it?
Can I take the conversation back towards something that's really quite specific, more specific to some of the development banks? And one of the challenges that we face, maybe Amelie, I'll go to you this first, but one of the challenges that we face is, to some extent, there's there's a need to sort of balance. On the one hand, for example, in Africa, we have 650 million people who don't have access to reliable power. In many of those, in many countries, gas is the cheapest source, of the cheapest sort of fuel source available. How do we reconcile that, addressing that challenge of access to power with the obvious challenges of the climate emergency and the need as much as possible to eliminate carbon fuel? So, Amelie, I know that's something that you think about a lot at CDC. So why don't you start?
Thank you. Yeah, think about and talk about a lot as well with many people. I think my view is that we have to deliver on the SDGs. Electricity, whether it's access at the sort of household level or for industrial growth and development, is essential. And at the moment, for many of the countries that CDC in particular serves, gas probably is the necessary investment that is needed in the next 5 to 10 years, alongside a lot of investment in the grid infrastructure, so that then actually these countries can start to bring in more renewables, particularly utility scale renewables, storage, as we see, as you said, John, it's another exponential technology in terms of coming down, the rate at which the costs are coming down. But we can't wait for the grid systems to be ready to absorb these technologies, and people need power, electricity now. So so I do see there is an important role, and I think that is and can and should be consistent with actually where we need to be on climate change. I mean, I think what we've seen for countries, the announcement, and actually it was very interesting to see the Walmart announcement. I think that had passed me by. I think I was more focused on China's announcement, but China's announcement to be net zero by 2060, I think many are calling that game changing in terms of international politics and how that, how the climate agenda moves. And probably that commitment alone, they estimate, could take 0.3 of a centigrade off the current path we're facing. And I think it's those economies that are heavily reliant on coal and how quickly they can transition, not necessarily into gas, but into renewables, whilst recognizing that the less developed countries, will need to increase more in gas power to develop and then be able to bring in more renewables over time.
John, you agree with that?
I totally agree with it. I mean, you kindly identified me as an environmentalist, so people might assume that I'm going to resist that. But I actually think we're facing nested crises. And if we don't address the social dimensions of the global goals, we're going to have a collapse that way. If we don't address the environmental ones, the same thing. And we've somehow got to, and this has always been the spirit and always the intent and ambition of sustainable development, we've got to be much better at bringing these things together. And I think there is an urgency that comes from the social crises or whatever, which mean that we've got to just throw whatever we got at those sort of problems. And I think the transition from one form of energy has to be absolutely fundamentally built into whatever we do. And as long as that's happening, then I'm more relaxed, although people like me will no doubt be arguing that the timescales, even for China, 2060 is a long time away, although the scale of what they're promising to do is just outlandish. And I agree, Amelie, I think it is potentially a game changer. I hope it's a game changer in the country itself, but we'll see.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about something else that we hope will be a game changer, and that's COP26. And obviously a huge priority for the UK government. So what needs, if you were advising the government on, and I know Amelie is advising the government on COP26, I mean, what advice would you give them? So, what can they do to really make this a game-changing moment?
Well, the obvious thing is to say, don't field an all-male team. I really mean it, because you look at the countries that have dealt with COVID-19 well, and many of them are run by women. I mean, it's an obvious point. And if you look at the ESG fund performance through the pandemic, many of the ones that have done well are actually also either run by women or have quite a high proportion of women. So when I see the UK government doing that, I think it is I don't know, it's a declaration of intent, and it's an intent that I really don't either trust or believe in. So there's plenty of time to change the gender balance. Now that's only one piece of this, but I also think the youth element of the equation is absolutely fundamentally important. I've been out on some of the school climate change marches, and I've talked to some of the young people who've been involved in that. And I think we are at a very interesting phase in all of this, where we can either lose or we can gain younger people. I think they are increasingly anxious, and the danger is that it'll flash over into anger about climate. And now you've got all the other things that are being dumped in their collective lap. So I think we've got to break with precedent with COP26. We've got to do things that are absolutely almost unbelievable to the wider world. So whether it's Walmart or China, for God's sake, Boris, the rest of the world is trying to model for you how you might do this sensibly. Sorry, that's going slightly off-piste and slightly political, but the one thing I would say is that all of this has become now, with a small p, fundamentally political. And we're going to have to do the politics in the way that people like myself have sort of tried to shy away from for a very long period of time. Now it's real. We've got to do the politics.
Amelie, what are you advising the government on COP26?
Well, I don't know where to begin. No, I think, there's a lot of, I think what's really great about the COP26 agenda is that they're focused on the negotiations, but then they also want to use the opportunity in the UK's leadership, both of COP26 as well as the G7, and actually also Italy's also partnering on COP26 and is G20 host as well. So how to really make a significant impact in the real economy and in a few key areas. And the clean energy transition is one that they've prioritized, particularly working with those countries that are heavily reliant on coal, so India and South Africa in particular in our regions, to make that kind of more rapid transition out of coal. There's a very strong focus on nature-based solutions, and also, as we know, because we're already locked into certain climate impacts, the need to focus more on adaptation and resilience. And so I think in all those three areas, and then finance, both public and private, is sort of underpinning all of those three areas. And I think there is a real, how the UK can show leadership through COP26, through the G7, through G20, but also very, very importantly through bilateral engagement with countries to really start to make the systemic changes that are going to be needed. And I think all of those activities beyond the negotiations itself are going to hopefully really create the basis for this, hopefully an exponential decade where we really do start to deliver on the SDGs and ensure significant progress towards the Paris Agreement by 2030.
Thank you. So let's go. We've got, I think, 10 minutes left. So I want to just, we've had a number of questions from the audience. And so I wanted just to try to run through some of those if I can. So first one for you, John, is, I suppose we're back to the politics, but can you talk about how much harm is being done by the current political situation in the United States? Interesting, the comparison to China, which just mentioned. Can the rest of the world make significant progress if the US is not willing to be part of the effort?
Simple answer, probably not. A less simple answer is it's probably going to have to, almost regardless of what happens in November. I've felt for several years now, and I love the US. I have family there, I have lots of friends, but it's a civil war, and we remember what happened with the last one and how long that took to clear. This is a breakdown, almost a nervous breakdown of a superpower, and we saw it happen with the Soviet Union before. I also believe that the United States has the capacity to reinvent itself. It does that periodically. And in some ways, I think we shouldn't just panic and think, they're going to go off in a completely different direction. We're going to be left becalmed. We've got to keep on trucking with the good stuff that is been doing. And I think, you know, American CEOs and business leaders that we talk to just look with complete awe or horror at things like the European Green Deal, for example, because they don't see very much evidence of that. And yet, you know, we look at what's happening in the Trump White House, and it's like looking into a rat's nest. I mean, in a way, it sort of doesn't matter, because at the same time, you've got cities, you've got some states, you've got companies developing the new technologies of the future. And this is almost like a, I don't know quite how to, it would seem to belittle the importance of what's going on in the United States at the moment. But in a way, there's a momentum building around the new economic order. And in a way, the politics are struggling, not only to catch up or keep up, but actually what we're seeing with the Trump and many of the populists, you see it, and I won't list the countries, but including our own, where people are trying to hold on to the old order. And the more the old order gets shaken, which I believe is going to happen with growing intensity, the more people will go back to what they feel confident with. And you see Scott Robinson, the Prime Minister of Australia, holding up a piece of coal just in the midst of the fires there and saying, this is the future. And you think, what's going on in that man's mind? And I think you're going to see a huge wave of or a raft of political leaders and CEOs being swept out because they're no longer fit for purpose. Doesn't mean that the next ones in are going to be dramatically better, but their mindsets will be different, and therefore they'll be better prepared to help us all cope with what's coming at us, both risks and opportunities.
Okay, another question, John, for you. Somebody asking, some people like Mark Benioff are talking about building stakeholder capitalism. What do you make of it? Does that ally with your thinking? Is it?
Well, of course it does, but you look back 40 years and you saw the Business Roundtable that made that declaration, 180 some CEOs, one British and the rest American, and they were going to go into stakeholder capitalism. Well, hallelujah, but they said exactly the same thing 40 years ago. So we've got to really keep a close watch on these CEOs and the people, as you know, the people who invest in them, as you said earlier on, Nick. We've really got to step up, and we've got to almost assume now that the money, the resources that we've struggled to get in the past to do what we wanted to do, from limits to growth onwards, are now not the problem. The problem is, what are we going to do, and how are we going to make that work for pretty much everyone on the planet, and how are we going to do whatever we intend to do in time. And so that's why I think we did a conference early on this year in January with Aviva investors, 300 people, and right across the wall, the message was step up or get out of the way. And I'm directing that challenge at myself, not just at our organization. I think it's one that we've all got to address to whatever we're planning to do. Yeah, enough.
Okay, so another question, I'll start with you on this one, Emily, is on, you know, we've talked about government, we've talked about sort of private sector and companies, but what is the role for the general public? And to what extent do we need to see a consumer-led demand for sustainability, as well as galvanizing companies into change? Grant?
Yeah, no, that's I mean, it's a key issue. I think, you know, we're already seeing, and particularly with demographic change, and as John emphasized, you know, as the sort of millennials are now using, well, not just voting power, but, you know, their purchasing power is starting to have more effect. You know, I think we are seeing changes, quite significant changes. You know, I think it's interesting, having lived in the US for a while, I saw far less of that in the US than I see here in Europe. And it really does feel like a very different place in terms of the social demand now, and the you know, it's becoming much more, sustainability is much more embedded in the culture of Europe, and of course differences across different European countries, and I do include the UK and Europe because we are still part of the continent. We haven't detached and floated off and attached to another continent. So I do see a lot of, and I think also the other sort of important area is also issue of savings, and where do we put our, as we hear this, make my money matter and all of that. I think that also is going to be increasingly important in sort of influencing both government, but importantly investors as well. So I think, yes, it's very important. It's probably not, it's not sufficient on its own, I don't think. And I think also partly that there isn't probably the level of awareness of consumers in some types of products in particular. I think we were probably all very shocked to hear about the factories up in Leicester, and because I think of sustainability in terms of social dimension as well, not just the environmental aspects. But shocking to hear that that's happening here in the UK, and I think one of the issues that will need to be addressed is the issue of affordable, sustainable products, because there is a demand for really cheap products, but that often leads to unsustainable practices. And how do we accelerate the affordability of sustainable consumer products?
Yeah. John, the role of the consumer?
Well, just very quickly, in the late 80s with a colleague, I did a book called The Green Consumer Guide. It sold 1 million copies in 18 months. And the movement that it was part of had a huge impact on business. The problem is consumers cannot remain anxious and agitated or angry or whatever for very long. We basically want somebody else to sort this out for us. So now here we are again. I'm not going to rely on millennials and Gen Z and all the rest of it to sort this out for us. I think this is a task for everybody. Everyone's got to take a degree of responsibility. I do think things could be made much easier for people to make the right choices. So I've had my own pension fund for 40 years because I've been sort of largely freelance, and I had invested it in ESG and socially responsible investment funds. I had somebody review that about a year ago, and what he found shocked me rigid. And it took me 5 months of really intensive work to get our investments out of the things that they were in and to put them into the future, at least as I see it. Now, that is criminal. It should not be so hard for people to move their money into from bad things to good things, or from not so good things into better things. And I think Richard Curtis's Make My Money Matter campaign is fundamentally important. If it works, it'll cascade in all sorts of other ways. So we must give it as much of a following wind as we possibly can.
Thank you. So we've got just 1 minute left. So let me just quickly ask both of you, if there was one thing, one call for action, one message you'd like to give to sort of corporate chief executives today, what would that message be? Amelie, do you want to go first?
I think be determined to make the changes that are needed. I mean, sort of show that real genuine leadership. And I think what's interesting, we saw again New York Climate Week last week. There's now over 1,500 companies that have made a commitment to be net zero, and and this is phenomenal. I mean, this is trillions of dollars of value, and but so showing that leadership isn't it's a leadership role within a community of leaders on this agenda, and I think recognizing though that commitment is excellent, but it's the actions to deliver on that are now needed over the coming decade.
Thanks. John, last word to you.
Get out more. When the roof is coming around your head, the temptation is to stay chained to your desk and sort of do whatever you can. The future is out there. The future is incredibly exciting. It's going to be quite challenging too, but by God, it's exciting. Go out and see some of the people who are helping to create it and seeing what you can do to play into that. So yeah, get out more.
Great. So thank you. Look, our time is up. So I want to thank both our panelists. Thank Amelie, obviously from CDC, and especially John Elkington. And the book is called Green Swans, and I would recommend it to everybody. And that was a fascinating discussion. I mean, we're facing a challenge of enormous magnitude, but I think it's certainly great to know, John, there are people like you willing to stand up and take a leadership position as you've done for decades now. And so we thank you for that, and we thank you particularly for spending the time with us today. Thank you, and thank you
for what you do.
Thank you, and thanks everybody for listening. Bye bye.
Thanks.
Bye bye.